Right, well, greetings, viewers. So we're just starting a little conversation here. Alex and I met in a sort of networking context, and we found we had some topics of interest in common, and we hope that our conversation will provide people some stimulating thinking. So Alex, how would you like to introduce this?
Well, hi, Peter, and good morning, everybody. Hello, everybody. Thank you very much for inviting me along to have a chat. I've been thinking about these ideas for some time, but it was more about something that's really present day, how a present day event or something that's happened, etc., especially particularly around this COVID and pandemic, etc., has been sort of making me think about really this idea of how thoughts and beliefs govern our lives more so than perhaps we appreciate. And that's what came in. I'm particularly interested in health and well-being. I work with a health and well-being organisation. But it was the sort of deeper idea of subconscious thoughts, things that we've adopted from an early age, again, without even realizing it, govern how we think, how we act, how we live our lives. As I say, more so than we appreciate. And one of the things that, something that I've been looking at in general over quite a long period of time is, if you like, the sort of our inner mental workings, our psychological function, how we think, how we feel, etc., etc. And I know that it's very, very easy for us to accept things without even question. We just assume that, particularly if it's an authority, an expert, a higher power, whatever it is, it could be something religious, whatever it is, that we just accept what somebody else is saying. Perhaps we look up to those people, group, individuals, whatever it is, and then we accept it and then talk about it as if it's what somebody else has said is true for us, and we don't even think perhaps as to what they're talking about. We haven't examined it for ourselves, and without realizing it, we go on to start acting and feeling and reacting in our everyday lives according to what we have picked up from very early on. We don't even realize that's what we're doing.
Yes.
And it's something that really and particularly around the whole thing around sort of the world, if you like, of microorganisms. The idea that something that we have grown up perhaps to believe or understand, that it's the devil or the enemy is in these bugs that come to cause us all sorts of trouble and mischief and disease, etc., etc. But I, with a background in science and with doing a lot of reading and discussions with people like yourself, etc., etc., over the period of time, and more so recently, I've been questioning this. I've been questioning whether it is quite as straightforward as that. It's not just that it is that it is the bugs that are the cause of all this misery. It's not as simple as that.
Mm-hmm.
And as an analogy, one could say, if we just blame the world outside of us for all our ills, in a way, that's the same sort of thing. If we don't start acknowledging our own position and our own responsibility and the role that we have to play, then really it's always somebody else's fault. Whether it's whether it's a government, whether it's a company, whether it's a microorganism or whatever, it is, always somebody else's fault. And thereby, quite frankly, actually, if you really think about it, we can do nothing about that.
Well, I come from a sort of slightly different background. So I actually studied theology. My degree was in theology and religious studies, and that it was a sort of thing that happened to me early on in my life, that I just saw the centrality of faith in life and belief and that whole thing, and I was going against the tide in all sorts of ways, you know. I just suddenly jumped the rails from studying physics to studying theology and religious studies. And that's been at the center of my life really all the time. So I can't claim to be a microbiologist expert in these fields. All I can say is I just bring my own perspective on them, and I see where people are acting on faith and belief and not on actual evidence, not on something which is presented, to, as you say, full examination, to be properly examined. And that's what we are, as far as I can say anyway, what we obviously had with COVID was that all sorts of stuff was going on the basis of, certain people saying this is the case, and everybody acting in rather extreme ways on the basis of that. So that's going to be I'm always going to say my contribution, if you like, to this is going to be say, okay, well, this is what we're saying. Is this what the theory, germ theory, disease theory, this is what it's saying? Okay, that's all, because ultimately, belief is something in your heart. You can't actually, I can't change anybody's beliefs, because that's not how it works, is it? I mean, these things are right here. And all I can say, okay, well, that's what you believe. Okay, I don't believe it. I mean, I can't, if I say I don't believe certain things, right, people will go ballistic because I say this. Every kind of word under the sun is thrown at you because you don't believe certain things. But I can't help it. I'm sorry for it. I just don't believe it. It doesn't present it to myself as a proper explanation of reality. That's not the reality I'm in. I mean, you may be in it, you may think that's your reality, but it's not what I see, So all I can do, because my whole life's thinking has been, I've moved from, I've started looking into belief, what I believe, right? And I've attached to various organizations at various points with different beliefs. At one point, you could say I had beliefs which are more along the sort of Hindu line, and then more on a Protestant Christian, Orthodox Christian, these various developments over the years. So I've at times in my life, I've had to say, okay, well, certain of my beliefs, need to be modified. I just see that this particular aspect, needs modification. So I'm okay with, polishing up my belief system, adjusting it as and when seems necessary. And I'm glad to speak to people who are open about that, and that's what we want here is a little oasis where people can feel free about that, and there's going to be no name calling. There's going to be no, taking offense because of what somebody else believes. So yeah, just giving my perspective on that.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Peter. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I don't subscribe to, or I do my best, let's put it this way, I do my best not to subscribe to, as you say, name calling or judging anybody else, let alone myself. But it's easier said than done. Mm-hmm. And I got involved with, one could say, a sort of esoteric spiritual psychology group, if you like, many years ago. And in essence, which if you like, followed a particular path, a particular teaching, that wasn't just hadn't just gone down one particular theological route or religious route. It drew from many different, I mean, whether it was Christianity, whether it was Hinduism, Buddhism, or whatever it was, they were all there were ideas that it was like coming at something but from a slightly different perspective. And what it did, I mean, the person who, as we referred to him as our teacher, if you like, the person we referred to, he would often give us talks about various subjects, but he often would say, he would stop mid-sentence, he would just look at us and he would say, don't believe a word I'm saying. Go out and find it out for yourself. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Start thinking for yourself. Now, I mean, what we were encouraged to do is to ask ourselves, what do you mean by that? You know, what is meant by sort of finding out for yourself? You said
Yeah.
about research and evidence, etc. And the only thing we do have, and this is my understanding, the only thing we do have is we have an ability to observe.
Yes.
There are two things about that ability to observe. One is which direction is it going in? So are we observing the world outside of us from a place in us that we may assume to be objective, when in fact it's far from it? Because that place within us,
Yes,
is already subjective because of what I said earlier, all these imitation and adoption of these beliefs and opinions and prejudices from our peers, our parents,
yeah,
the world that we've sort of been brought up in, etc., which mean that it's very difficult for us to see things in an objective way. So that's number one.
yes,
What part of us is doing the seeing or the observing? And the other thing is that actually, perhaps in order to begin to find a place within us that's a bit clearer sighted, we have to start turning the direction of observation around, from rather
yes,
than looking out, is to actually looking in.
right.
And that isn't easy. That doing that action is quite a task. But in doing so, we can begin to question the foundations upon which those beliefs and prejudices and opinions,
Yes,
etc.,
yeah,
are based upon. And
yeah,
more often than not, as you start sort of bringing some light to bear, if you like, on that understanding that I have, or any of us have, it can begin to crumble away.
yeah,
Because it isn't, you know, it doesn't really, to be in honesty, it doesn't really hold up very
yeah.
well in the light of an honest search or research.
Yeah. So I guess what we're doing today, we're sort of throwing a bit of a stone into the water, aren't we? Sort of just, you know, so that it's for people who already sort of question things a bit and would like to sort of get a bit of exercise in that, stretch their understanding things. And also for people who are beginning in that, or just a bit open, you know, whoever can listen us out for more than a few minutes, you know, just going in that direction. There's some fairly big assumptions going on, which we really need to look at, you know, and so that's the idea. And we have a particular one really today, don't we, which is what's called germ theory. So I think what the best thing is for you to sort of, you know, develop your thoughts on that, on germ theory. And I will just come from, you know, my sort of position of questioning lots of things and even assumptions behind germ theory itself. So I'm just going to say, okay, well, you know, what about from this perspective? But I think you're going to take us through what you see the chief issues with germ theory are.
I will. What I'm going to do is the sun's just gone through.
Okay, right. Okay, no
blind,
problems about that. We'll just
put the blind down so that it's not shining on my face.
Yeah, great. Okay, cool. It's good to have the sun.
Yeah. So yeah, with a many moons ago, a degree in microbiology. We did delve a little bit into the history of microbiology, but not an awful lot. But Louis Pasteur was often referred to as the father of microbiology. And after a number of years of doing research, it has to be said, research that was done in the laboratory, he arrived at this idea, encapsulated, if you like, in a so-called germ theory, that it was microorganisms that carried and caused disease.
Yes.
Well, about the same time, there were two other scientists who were also looking at the same sort of. In fact, there were a number of them that were looking at this subject area, and Bernard and
Béchamp,
yeah, that's right. And they arrived at a slightly different conclusion, in the sense that they came up with this sort of soil or terrain theory.
Yeah.
Germ theory effectively predicts that it is the germs that is causing, if you're in the presence of these bugs, they're going to cause disease. Soil or terrain theory predicts that it is the environment, which could be a pool of water, it could be an ecosystem, it could be our own internal environment, as in as a human, as a biological being, if you like, a species. It is our own internal environment that, if that environment is not working as it's meant to be working, or if it's toxic, or it's just not working, then it is the microorganisms that can take advantage of that and cause disease. And this is something that, in other words, it's not as straightforward as, oh yes, this particular microorganism, whether it's a bacteria or a virus, causes this particular condition. As we've been talking about COVID and the pandemic, etc., we'll stay with that. And because if you look at, say, groups of people in the population, not everybody is developing COVID. And also, people are developing it from the extreme, and in those cases, this results in their demise, to those people who are completely asymptomatic. So the germ theory doesn't entirely explain why there are these differences.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you look at the terrain or soil theory, in other words, the environment, well, the environment includes people's immune system. We have an innate natural defense system, which is highly evolved, highly complex, and works in a number of different ways of defending and neutralizing any foreign materials that, if you like, come into the space, into the individual's environment. And that has been around, for donkey's years. I mean, it's not just the humans, it's mammals. In fact, all living things have some sort of defense mechanisms. But if those defense mechanisms or other systems are not working correctly, and we know this, it is well known that if somebody is, as they say, immunocompromised, if they are, quite often people, when they're hugely fatigued, they're more likely to develop some sort of illness which involves an infectious agent. And so when people say, I caught a cold, if you think about what that's saying, it's suggesting that it's just random, and I caught the cold. It was something that that gave me the disease. But there was nothing in that germ theory that suggests that actually we should actually do something about ourselves.
Yeah.
And there are plenty of things. We can either avoid the habits that cause the immune system to has a deleterious effect on the immune system. In other words, it runs it down. Or we can do something, or we can do something to basically, say, boost it, but we can certainly sort of strengthen it. So there are a number of things that we can do if we were but aware of them. And as I've often pointed out to people, if you listen to the information coming from the so-called experts and authorities and the state, there was precious little information talking about that second bit.
Yes.
The germ, or the terrain or soil theory.
Yes.
About, well, hang on, guys, what can we do about ourselves?
Yeah.
It was all about masking, isolating, and then drugs were given when they caught the disease, and then there was the vaccine developed to prevent it happening.
Yes.
And so going back to what I originally said, our thoughts and beliefs govern our lives. So if we think that it's all about the bugs that cause the disease, that's how we will behave. And there will be mechanisms and systems in place to defend against those bugs, the enemy, to destroy the bugs, etc., etc. Very little is done about what we can do about ourselves.
Yeah, well, that's it. I mean, it was sort of a glaring thing. And I think of all the examples, it's somebody pushing a trolley of junk food, a huge trolley around the supermarket of junk food with a mask on. Yes. Or wearing the mask, all day, and then going outside for a cigarette, lifting up the mask to having a cigarette, then putting it back down for safety. Thinking about this, what's going on, what's the logic of that? So it's the whole idea that, yeah, you're not responsible for your health, and it's some random outside invisible force that's trying to do you in, and you have these sort of hero squad who's going to rescue you by their various tricks and methods. And this is the system we have, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I mean, there has been an alternative. I mean, if you go back, for the last 200 years, there's been a very substantial body of literature of another view. And this, I mean, have you heard of Graham bread? Do you know this expression, Graham bread, as in the name Graham?
Yes, I have. I've heard of Graham
yes.
associated with a movement in America in the 1800s.
Yeah.
I think it was referred to as Grahamism or something.
That's it. So basically, and I noticed this when I started living on the continent, that it's really the same as wholemeal. I think there's a bit of a difference between wholemeal and Graham bread, that they separate and then put them back together or something. But anyway, it's similar principle to having wholemeal bread. Yeah. So it has all those nutrients in it. But it just happens to be the name because it's what's generally called the hygiene movement.
Yes.
And, he was basically saying you are responsible for your own health. It's not some outside forces. And as I say, there's a whole body of literature. I think the most prominent representative in the 20th century was a guy called Shelton.
Right.
And he wrote very extensively on it. And I've read quite a few of his works. But, it is the point about, what is causing sickness, disease, whatever. And he coined the phrase, or at least promoted it, of instead of saying a symptom, right, we should say biogony, i.e. life, bios in Greek, agony, like an effort, a striving. So a symptom is an effort of the body towards life, right? Now, this is very, very fundamental difference, right? So if you cough, right, your body is trying to make you better because some dust has just gone into your throat, right? Okay, so that's nothing bad. It's the product of a positive life energy.
Yes.
And that, I would suggest, is a much better explanation of what one would call the extraordinary actions of your bodies, whether temperature, coughing, sneezing, growths, all these things. That some single positive energy, because what we have is the idea that it's the result of one of 10,000 or more negative energies which are trying to destroy you, and you have to fight.
Yes.
And these are very, very different philosophies and understandings. And the second one just is open to such abuse and such productive of so much chaos.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And there's a saying, it's got the saying, given the chance, the body will heal itself.
Yeah.
I mean, if you cut yourself badly and you go into a casualty department, you will be, the wound is debrided and is cleaned up. They may have topical antiseptic or whatever it is. They'll approximate the ends of the cut, put a bandage on it. But what does the healing?
Yeah. Exactly.
The healing comes from within.
Yes.
You get all the platelets, you get all the immune system actually kicks in. There's an inflammatory response. The immune system kicks in, starts bringing in the repair mechanisms that start mending the area itself. And that's the vital thing. The healing actually comes from within. There is a force, there is an innate force that is working in the body to maintain a balance, to maintain wellness. And I think that's the thing that is often overlooked. And at the very least, in terms of responsibility, all we have to do, I say all we have to do, but all we have to do is just put food and drink into our mouths. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And we are in an environment, particularly I think in the West, where we can't seem to do that properly. Yeah. Because you said earlier about eating diets that are so highly processed that the idea of nutritional quality seems to have completely been left behind.
Yeah.
So we actually aren't giving our bodies a chance to heal themselves. We're doing quite the opposite. And so going back to this idea about thoughts and beliefs govern our lives, if we question and bring to bear what you were saying, and this idea of looking at something from a slightly different perspective, it's powerful stuff. It starts changing.
Yes, well, you
our
just
decisions and
see,
our
you
actions.
know, that's right. You just see such fear and paranoia.
Yeah.
I mean, there's another principle. I mean, I don't know if you have Occam's Razor, right? This is philosophical principle, right?
Yes.
Which
Yeah.
basically says you shouldn't multiply entities beyond necessity, right? So if you've got a proposition, the fewer entities, the fewer concepts of things which must exist in and of themselves, the more elegant, the more viable that proposition is, that theory. And disease theory is I would say, quite the opposite. It's quite, you know, is about as far outside Occam's Razor as you can get, because disease theory proposes multiplicity of diseases, you know, that there are these, that they have some sort of existence. I mean, this is the point I'm saying, that it's based on the idea that they somehow exist, right? Well, we know symptoms, or as I would say, biogonies exist. You know, we know that a cough exists. We know that a lump on your skin exists. We know that a fever, that's a real thing, okay? And we don't need to invent that. We don't need to create, that's real. But the question is the cause, right? Now, if you say there's one life cause, life energy, well, that's pretty elegant. That's pretty efficient. And it's just one energy. If you say there's 10,000 and next week they're going to discover a new one, and one doctor's going to say it's this one that's causing it and one another, and wow, that's pretty chaotic, isn't it? I mean, that's a pretty good illustration, you know, of, I would say, the validity of Occam's Razor, that it just sort of cuts through this. I mean, what, you know, it's intellectual chaos.
Yes.
Because the actions of the body exist, but these things, what is it? Where is it? Where is COVID? Where is influenza? Where is pneumonia?
Yeah.
You know, what dimension is that in? Does it have a, you know, intelligence? Or, I mean, it's attacking you. Apparently it's attacking you. So why? Why is it attacking you? What kind of thing is it?
Well, it's very interesting you say that, because something that I learnt in the laboratories back in the 1980s, which has stayed with me ever since, was that when we wanted to grow particular microorganisms, we used Petri dishes.
Yes.
And we manipulated the conditions to grow particular microorganisms. Now think about that. We manipulated the conditions. In other words, the conditions, and that included the food, so the correct food, had to be there first for those biological entities to multiply.
Yes.
Now, in other words, what we were doing in the laboratories, we were simply harnessing an existing law, if you like. The conditions have to be there first, or the food has to be there first for this thing to grow. And it's the same thing with respect to going back to this idea of terrain theory. The conditions have to be there first in order for these so-called, if you think of the word disease, dis-ease, in other words, there's a you said chaos, etc., chaos, intellectual chaos, etc. But also, if you think of if the body's normal balance, which is what it's designed to do, the homeostatic balances, if they start going awry, then other things begin to come in. And that's the thing that, you know, what rather than fighting the so-called disease, we need to look at the imbalance that's taken place in the body. In other words, the conditions that have allowed this to happen. Now, as an example, my wife rented out a house that we have not far from here. And the family that lived there were having a lot of problems with mold growing on the walls. And the husband was emphatically stating that we had a leak from the roof. Now they moved out. We got some people to come in and have a check everything out. The original builder who did the roof and everything, there was no leak on the roof. And I knew that in any case. What the problem was that the ventilation wasn't sufficient.
Yeah.
It was a detached house overlooking the North Atlantic. So you can imagine that they would want to keep the place warm.
Yes.
In the winter. So what do? They shut everything up.
Yeah.
They virtually hermetically sealed themselves whilst they were cooking, whilst they were boiling kettles, whilst they were breathing, whilst they were sweating. So imagine the water vapor in the atmosphere, landing on cold walls, liquid. So you had an ideal environment for those spores, those mold spores to grow.
Mm-hmm.
As soon as we got the builder to come and bore holes in various parts of the walls and put in vents, the problem has completely disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
Because all we've done is we've changed the conditions.
Yes. Yeah.
Those spores, those mold spores, well, you know yourself, if you leave bread out, you'll get penicillium mold or aspergillus mold growing on the bread because it's got warm, moist area, and you've got food. They're around in the atmosphere all the time. But you change the conditions, they don't grow. And so if you start looking at this from a completely different aspect, it changes. It's powerful stuff.
Well, that's it. And you know, ultimately, we want to have health policy based on this kind of approach, don't we? You know, so you know, people will be healthier if their diet is healthier and if their environment is healthier, if their water is cleaner. That's it.
Well, interestingly, I remember some years ago, someone claiming, oh, it was antibiotics that got rid of disease. It wasn't. The incidence of bacterial disease infections was dropping before the antibiotics were introduced, and the reason was because people had access to clean water. The housing was better. Education was better. Habits, cleanliness, making sure that they weren't sort of going from the toilet without washing their hands to going to prepare food, yada yada yada, etc., etc. So understanding changed. As soon as that changed, the incidence of those diseases that were associated with those lack of clean water, poor housing, etc., etc., and education, it changed things. So it wasn't the drugs that did the job.
Yeah,
it was changing the conditions.
And that was the people of Leicester. You heard about Leicester in the 19th century. You know, there was the smallpox vaccination. You know, you can read about it in Susan Humphrey's book that I mentioned. And you know, they said no, we don't want. They saw some sort of connection with vaccines and mortality, and they stopped them, and they cleaned up the city. And that's what and you know, smallpox or that kind of symptom just vanished more or less. So you know, that's what does it. It's been as you say, public hygiene, which has been the driving force of, you know, improvements in modern health, I would say.
Now the trouble, I mean, with my cynical hat on, of course, doing all the things that we've been suggesting about changing the conditions doesn't actually earn certain organizations a shed load of money.
Well, that's it. And what, you know, why didn't the natural health and hygiene movements of the 19th century, why, you know, what happened to that? You know, where did it go? You know, I mean, at one point I read that, you know, nearly half the doctors or more than half the doctors in America were of that inclination. So if that had continued, that would be the dominant system now.
Well, then we're now going into that whole area about sort of Rockefeller and his influence in the medical schools, etc. Basically pushing out. In other words, that a bit like the germ theory and terrain theory, the germ theory prevailed. The idea of dealing with things with the ways we've just been talking about, naturally, using natural solutions rather than attacking this so-called disease phenomenon. That way of doing things was edged out.
Of course.
And that goes back to what I was saying about the thoughts and beliefs. So, you know, this is 100 years ago. So now the prevalent thought is, oh, there are these alien diseases outside of us.
Yes.
We've got to either defend ourselves from or attack.
Yes. That's it. That's it.
And so going back to what I was saying, if you start, and so what I think you mentioned it earlier about fear and hysteria, fear of all these sort of supposed entities, if you like,
Yes.
that supposedly exist. And it means we're sort of hock to the experts who know how to treat us.
Yes, exactly.
Whereas it's almost like it takes away from us any kind of notion, empowered notion, if you like, that we can actually have an effect on our own health destiny.
Yeah, and because there's some very powerful vested interests. So there's obviously the simple commercial interest, that you can sell medicines, you can sell pills and the whole paraphernalia. So that in and of itself is an obvious, it's an obvious benefit to that. And so we can see there the interest. And then I would say, government itself, there's a massive benefit to that in the invisible enemy, isn't it? The invisible enemy is a wonderful tool for manipulation. So it's the big commercial interests and people, and when you're talking about, controlling the masses, as it were, there's nothing better really than an enemy you can't see, but that all about. You're the expert on the enemy, or at least you have the experts in the industry on the enemy, and the government is, passing on their instructions.
Yeah.
And that's what we've witnessed.
But very, very much so. And I think the other thing is that you mentioned something at the beginning about evidence, and I've got a problem with the way in which the current research methodology is, I think, skewered.
Yes.
To provide so-called proof that that the diseases exist and that the treatments for these diseases are effective. And if you say to anybody, well, have you thought about a more natural approach like water?
Mm-hmm.
In fact, I think I did say that to somebody quite recently, who said to me, oh, well, of course, it's all the placebo effect. And ironically, I turned around, and you mentioned we talked about faith as well, and I turned around and said, well, do you know what? Maybe if somebody is feeling and getting better because of the placebo effect, why does it matter? And to us lay person, to us the patient, what matters is that we get better. Mm-hmm. To the experts, to the authorities, to the state, to the companies that have vested interests, they make their living, their existence is predicated on the bit that matters, is that it's the active ingredient or whatever it is that they're producing.
Yes.
Is the thing that's having the effect.
Yeah. So
of course it's understandable why it's anything other than that is dismissed as, oh well, that's the placebo effect.
Yeah.
In other words, it's almost like a sort of monopoly on truth and monopoly on what is, what works, etc., when it comes to healthcare.
Yeah, that's it. So anything that questions that has to be dismissed in some way or other.
Yes, and it's so in a way it's quite understandable. It's, some people would say, reprehensible, but you can see why saying or discussing these sort of things for some groups which have a vested interest mm-hmm. in not talking or not sort of discussing these things don't like it.
Yeah.
Having said that, going back to what I was saying about sort of I suppose personal awareness, etc., I know also from personal experience that it's not easy to change your way of thinking just like that.
Yes.
It comes gradually, and as you said earlier, all we can do is, if you like, the ripple effect. We're putting a stone into the pond, and these ideas hopefully begin to get people to think in a slightly different way. We can't legislate for that.
Yes.
Hopefully that by beginning to explore a different way of thinking that one might begin to experiment with a different way of acting and living, so that we're not so frightened, we're
Yes.
not so reliant on an external body to look after our health.
Yeah, sure.
We start beginning to behave differently. For instance, you've noticed I've been sipping water. So maybe drinking, just even hydration, drinking more.
Yes. Yeah, sure.
It's something really simple. It doesn't cost anything, and
Mhm.
it's a very simple way of actually looking after ourselves.
Yeah, that's it. The best solutions are often free, aren't they?
Yeah,
So at
but often
least, or
free,
low cost anyway. Yeah.
low cost, and I mean, people use the much used word empower
Yeah.
people.
Mhm.
It is powerful.
Yeah.
It does give people not only the responsibility,
Mhm.
but the power to say, actually, I don't want to do it this way.
Yes.
I'm questioning this. I've started looking or reading about it, or I've listened to,
Yeah.
whether it's listening to us or doing their own reading, etc. And I'm not so sure about this. And also the other thing is, in a way, what makes sense to us?
That's it. Yeah, it has to. I think because the whole system, there's this sort of fear and anxiety and stress that's all there, and everybody's acting, as you say, outside this sort of basic sense of intuition and just feeling okay with things. That there isn't that in this whole diagnosis drama. I often speak about the drama of the diagnosis, and that can kill you. If the doctor says you're going to die in 3 months, maybe you will. If you believe it. Big drama, big all that stuff, and creates a very negative mindset, mentality.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to put in a word for you mentioned water fasting. The idea of actually giving your body a complete break.
Yes.
And this, very powerful thing. The fact is that if you stop eating for a certain amount of time, your body can redirect its energies. A lot of energy is focused on the whole process of digestion.
Yeah.
And so, anything from intermittent fasting, which just means like, shortening the window in the day when you eat, sort of starting eating a bit later and finishing a bit earlier, that kind of thing, intermittent fasting, or a more extended fast where you, for days, maybe you go without. And this can work wonders, because as we said, the body has this innate healing power, and you're just allowing it to have more sway, influence.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, yeah, I think it's not easy. It's not an easy thing to start thinking differently. It can be very disturbing for ourselves. Now, I'm now talking about really for ourselves, notwithstanding what anybody else says. But when you do start thinking differently, it can be both enormously enlightening.
Yes.
And there was almost like they're strange bedfellows, disturbance and enlightenment. They sort of go together, if you like, because you're being. The way I look at it is, you said earlier, we're okay with that understanding, but I'd substitute the word okay with we sleep. We're in slumber. We just sort of drift along in this sort of haze of,
yes,
oh yes, that's the way it is. We don't question it, etc. I haven't got the energy to, or whatever it is.
That's right, because if you step outside, and if you step outside the official narrative and way of thinking, then you're going to have friction sooner or later. And I guess we don't really like that, do we? Most of us want a fairly easy and quiet life.
Want a fairly easy and quiet, yeah. And so it's not an easy path, and it's not a, and if people want to continue slumbering, in fact, we're not sort of legislating, if you like, or saying, well, you must do this, or whatever it is, or mandating that you must behave in a particular way. However, I think if nothing else, it's offering. That's all we can do, is offer that there is another way.
Yeah.
without a shadow of a doubt, there is another way of looking at something.
Yeah.
And it's whether or not individuals, us and anyone else wants to take that step and begin to explore another way of looking at something.
Yeah.
And I think that's, if in terms of a message, if nothing else, if we were to ask anybody to give existence to the possibility that there is another way of looking at something, I think that's a start. That's all we can ever ask.
Yeah. Great. Okay, so I think that's a good way of concluding. I think we've covered the ground, and that sort of sums up the essence of what we wanted to talk about. So we'll wish our viewers bye, and we'll just close the recording, and hopefully see our viewers on another occasion.